The wall clock read 3 in the morning. At the quick-stop convenience store, silence reigned as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The cold fluorescent lights cast long shadows across half-empty shelves, and a steady hum came from the beverage cooler in the back. Sarah Mitchell, her uniform slightly wrinkled and dark circles under her eyes, was finishing up sweeping near the counter. It was her 3rd consecutive night shift. Exhaustion pressed against her from the inside like an invisible grip, but she held on. She always held on. "One more day and I'm done," she muttered, turning off the old coffee maker while stretching her neck. Sarah had no family in Phoenix. She'd arrived 2 years ago from southern Arizona, looking to start over after a string of difficult decisions. This store, though modest and lonely at night, gave her a certain peace, a routine that didn't change until tonight. As she was about to close the cash register, the door chime rang with a dry cling. Sarah frowned. The automatic doors should already be locked. She turned. 3 men crossed the entrance like they owned the place. They didn't bother looking around. The first was stocky, dark-skinned, with a scar running from his eyebrow to his cheekbone. His shirt was unbuttoned to the chest, and tattoos peeked out from his neck. "What part of clothes don't you understand?" Sarah asked with more firmness than she felt. "The part where you don't get to decide anything," the leader responded, approaching the counter. His voice was raspy, loaded with mockery. Sarah took a step back, reaching for the panic button under the register, but the second man, thinner, with restless eyes, was already rounding the counter. The third, young with a face that looked like he hadn't slept in days, stayed at the entrance watching outside. "We don't want money from the register, sweetheart. We want to see if you've got something more interesting to offer," Marcus, the leader, said as he took another step toward her. Sarah swallowed hard. She knew how this could end. She tried to stay calm, but her hand was shaking. "Look, take whatever you want. Just leave," she said, holding out a card that opened the emergency safe. Marcus stared at her, smiled sideways, and in a second snatched the card from her hand. Then, without warning, he reached out and tore her shirt with a single motion. The air froze. Sarah screamed and recoiled violently, covering herself with her arms. Marcus let out a disgusting laugh while the other 2 began to advance, surrounding her like wolves. "Stop!" she shouted, but her voice broke at the end. And then something changed. From the dark back of the store near the storage room, footsteps could be heard. They weren't hurried. They were firm, as if whoever was making them had no rush, no fear. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, covered in black leather, heavy jackets and loud boots. The first of them, a man about 50 years old, walked in front. His grey beard contrasted with steely eyes. On his vest, he wore a large patch with red letters, "Hell's Angels." "You heard the lady. Take what you want, but her steps and her dignity aren't for sale," Jake said, his voice deep, hoarse and calm. The 3 attackers froze. Marcus turned, and for an instant, his face showed doubt. "And who the hell are you? Some Halloween gang?" he spat, trying to maintain composure. "Nah, buddy, we're the answer to your bad decision tonight," said Tony, the second biker, tall and bald, with arms tattooed to the wrists. Jake didn't wait any longer. He took 2 quick steps toward Marcus, and with a sharp movement punched him directly in the stomach. Air left the attacker's lungs with a high-pitched groan, and he fell to his knees. The thin one tried to pull something from his pocket, but Dave, the third of the group, younger, with a crescent-shaped scar on his cheek, disarmed him with a blow from the butt of a small knife. In less than 10 seconds, 2 of the men were on the floor. The third, who'd been watching the entrance, fled through the door without looking back. Sarah was pressed against the wall, breathing heavily. The torn shirt hung from her shoulder, her chest rising and falling desperately. She looked at the bikers, tears welling up in her eyes, not knowing whether to thank them or fear them. Jake approached slowly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "You okay, kid?" She nodded, unable to speak. Tony was checking the pockets of the unconscious attackers, while Dave dragged one toward the exit. Jake removed his leather jacket and, with a careful gesture, placed it over Sarah's shoulders. "You're going to be all right." "It's over," he said, looking at her seriously but without harshness. Absolute silence reigned in the store. only interrupted by the beeping of the still-open cash register and the flickering of the open sign in the window. Jake turned to his companions. "Let's go." When they were already at the door, he stopped and gave Sarah one last look. "Leave the lights on a little longer. You're never as alone as you think." And they left. The roar of 3 motorcycles echoed through the Phoenix dawn, momentarily breaking the neighborhood's stillness. Sarah, with still trembling hands, sat behind the counter. Her breathing began to calm, but her mind was still spinning. She looked at the jacket over her shoulders. It smelled of leather, of highway, of something she couldn't describe, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like someone had been there for her. The silence that remained after the biker's departure was as thick as the smoke still floating in the store. Outside, the neon lights flickered, as if the place itself was trying to catch its breath. Sarah, still sitting behind the counter, didn't know whether to cry or laugh. The leather of Jake's jacket still covered her shoulders, warm, heavy, like a shield borrowed from a stranger. The 2 male attackers lay on the floor, motionless. One was unconscious, with a split lip and bleeding nose. The other was whimpering, clutching his ribs. The third, the one who fled, hadn't looked back, and with luck, he wouldn't return. But the roar of the motorcycles didn't go away completely. Within a few minutes, the 3 returned walking. Jake entered first, removing his gloves. His steps were measured, as if he was in no hurry to explain anything. "Still shaking?" he asked, looking at her without harshness. Sarah stood up clumsily. She didn't know whether to thank him or question his presence. Something inside her still didn't fully understand what had happened. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. Jake crossed his arms and let out a long sigh. "A ghost from the past. Though I prefer regular customer," he said with a tone that tried to be light. Tony and Dave were already checking on the 2 guys on the floor. One had a broken wrist, the other was barely breathing. Tony let out a low whistle. "These bastards came ready to mess things up. Look at this," he said, showing a small knife stained with dried blood. Jake didn't react. He just nodded and turned toward Sarah. "Your name's Sarah, right?" She hesitated before nodding. "My old man used to say only the brave work nights. Now I understand why." Sarah narrowed her eyes. Something in his voice, in the way he stood in front of her, seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Do we know each other?" she asked, more to herself than to him. Jake didn't answer immediately. He walked to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and set it on the counter. "Many years ago I used to come here. Well, before this was a store, this was an auto shop. Lightning Bolt, it was called." Sarah looked at him sharply. "Lightning Bolt Mitchell?" Jake nodded with a small smile. "Your old man and I shared more than one night fixing engines until the sun came up. Good man, stubborn as a mule but hands of gold." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Her father, Robert Mitchell, had died 10 years ago in a motorcycle accident. Since then, no one had mentioned his name with so much respect or so much nostalgia. "And why are you here now?" she asked, her voice a bit firmer. Jake looked directly into her eyes. "A hunch. Sometimes engines aren't the only things that make strange noises when something's about to break. Sometimes the soul gives warning too." Sarah didn't know what to say. She felt emotionally naked but not judged, just observed as if he knew what she'd lived through, what she carried. Dave, who until then had remained silent, approached. "I called some contacts. These 2 are going to disappear for a while. Don't worry, they won't bother you again." "And the other one?" Sarah asked. "If he's got any sense, he's already crossing state lines," Tony replied. Jake ran his hand through his beard. "It's not just about throwing punches. Sometimes you gotta remind cowards that there are places where darkness doesn't rule." Sarah lowered her gaze. The adrenaline was beginning to dissipate, and with it came the real weight of what had happened. The humiliation, the fear, the helplessness, but also the surprise. She'd been saved by men that at first glance anyone would cross the street to avoid. "Why you guys?" she said quietly. Jake came a little closer. "Because sometimes those of us who come from the asphalt also know what it's like to lose something valuable, something you can't get back, and we're not going to let someone else go through that if we can help it." Sarah swallowed. "What did you lose?" Jake smiled sadly but didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the wall clock. "It's almost dawn. You got coffee?" She nodded without thinking and went to the back, to the small storage room. The coffee maker was off, but still warm. As she was checking it, her eyes fell on an old cardboard box on a high shelf covered in dust. She didn't remember it. Curious, she carefully brought it down. Inside were yellowed papers, old invoices, some rusty tools, and a photo. A black and white photo. In it, two young men posed next to a 1993 Harley-Davidson motorcycle. One was clearly her father, younger, with his frank smile. The other was Jake. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She returned to the main room with the photo in hand. Jake saw it from afar. When she held it up, his face hardened for a second, then softened. "Your dad saved my life once," he said, without being asked. "I was a reckless kid. He taught me not to run before learning to brake. And now you do the same." Jake shrugged. "Sometimes. Other times we just follow the route destiny marks for us." Tony and Dave were ready to leave. Jake headed for the door, but before crossing it, he turned. "This store has memory, and so do you. Maybe you're not alone, Sarah." She pressed the photo to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake winked and left. This time, when the engines roared, Sarah didn't feel fear. She felt respect. And although the sun hadn't yet appeared, the interior of the store no longer seemed so dark. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the sky was already beginning to turn pale blue. Inside the store, dim light illuminated the shelves, now emptier than ever. Sarah held the photo in her hands as if it were a relic. She looked at it again and again, not understanding how that piece of paper could contain so many answers, and at the same time, so many questions. Jake was sitting on one of the stools in front of the counter, with a cup of black coffee he barely touched. "So it's true," she finally said. "You worked with him." Jake didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the photo, as if the scene portrayed still lived in his memory. "Your dad was the kind of man who spoke more with his hands than his mouth," he began to say in a low voice. "He knew what he was doing, and he never lied to you. If something couldn't be fixed, he told you. He didn't promise miracles." Sarah sat in front of him in silence. "And you, what were you doing there?" "I was running," Jake admitted. "From my home, from myself. I was 20, had just gotten out of the service, and didn't want to go back anywhere. Your dad gave me work without asking questions. He just told me, 'Here it doesn't matter where you come from, it matters if you know how to use a wrench.'" A slight tremor crossed Jake's face. Sarah noticed it. For the first time, his rough appearance seemed to yield to something deeper. "He talked about you, you know," Sarah murmured, "but he never mentioned your name. He said he had a friend who'd learned to fight with his heart, not with his fists." Jake pressed his lips together. "And yet here I am, using my fists." A heavy silence fell between them. The ticking of the clock seemed louder in that pause. "Why did you come back tonight, of all nights?" Sarah asked. Jake looked at his coffee cup, then at her. "I'm going to tell you the truth, even if it sounds weird. I didn't plan it. I woke up with a feeling, like someone was calling me without words. I thought about the shop, about your dad, and I came." Before Sarah could respond, a dry crash was heard from outside. The glass door vibrated, and then a harder blow made it shake. "Jake!" Dave shouted from the side hallway. "We got company!" Jake jumped up. His expression hardened immediately. Tony was already by the entrance, unwrapping a chain from his bike's handlebar. "It's the one who got away," he said, "but he didn't come alone." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She ran to the counter and looked at the security camera. 5 figures were approaching from the parking lot, all armed. The leader, clearly the same one who had fled, had a gun in his hand. "They're gonna come in," Sarah shouted, her heart in her throat. Jake turned to her. "Go to the storage room. Stay there. Don't come out." "No, do it now." Sarah obeyed, but as she backed away, her hand bumped into a panel under the cash register. A red button she'd never pressed. Without thinking, she touched it. Click. A dull sound indicated that something had been activated, but she was already running toward the back. Outside, chaos erupted. The attackers broke through the door with a metal bar. They came in shouting, firing into the air. but Jake was already prepared. With precision that didn't match his age, he slid across the floor and kicked the leg of the first one who crossed. The man fell, shooting at the ceiling. Tony, with the chain in hand, caught another by the neck and dragged him to a shelf, where he left him unconscious with a single blow. Dave dodged like a dancer, using the store environment to his advantage. A tray of cans, a box of cereal, anything was a weapon in his hands. Jake disarmed the leader in a maneuver that wasn't learned on the street. It was pure technique, combat precision. He threw him to the ground and aimed at him with his own weapon. "Who sent you?" he growled. The man, bleeding from the eyebrow, spat on the floor. You're not just some damn biker." "No, I'm a veteran from hell," Jake replied. In the back of the store, Sarah heard the screams, the blows, the crash of things breaking. She crouched next to an empty shelf, trembling. She didn't want to feel that helplessness again. But suddenly a different sound made her look up. A silent alarm was flashing on a panel in the storage room. A dim blue light was blinking intermittently. She didn't know what she'd done, but something had been set in motion. Someone was coming. Jake, now with the weapon in hand, kept the last two attackers cornered. One tried to escape through the side hallway, but Tony took him down before he reached the door. "How many more are out there?" Jake demanded. The leader, still on the floor, smiled with his broken mouth. "Enough to finish you off, but they're already coming for me. You don't know who you messed with." Jake didn't respond. He just knocked him out with a sharp blow and turned toward the back. "Sarah, you okay?" She came out slowly, her legs shaking. I pressed a button." Jake looked at her intently. "Where?" "Under the register. It was red." Jake blinked once, then muttered something she didn't understand. "What's wrong? That button isn't connected to the police." "Then who?" Before he could answer, another motorcycle roared in the distance, then another, and another. Jake clenched his teeth. "Someone who owes me favors, but if he comes, he also comes with his own ghosts." The echo of motorcycles approached like a storm on the asphalt. Sarah, still in the back room, heard the roar of engines with her heart racing. Jake was silent, like a soldier who knows the hardest battle hasn't yet begun. Tony adjusted the handle of his chain with a tense expression. Dave rested a steel baton on his shoulder, slowly twirling it with his fingers. They knew what was coming. These weren't common thieves. They were the others, the ones who didn't negotiate. Jake turned to Sarah. "I need you away from this." "No," she replied firmly. "Sarah, you already protected me once. I'm not going to sit back again while they tear you apart." Jake observed her in silence. In her gaze there was no fear, but a determination he recognized well. It was the same he once saw on her father's face, one night many years ago, facing a gang of vandals who wanted to burn down the old shop. "Then go to the counter. There's an old shotgun behind the refrigerator. It was your dad's. I don't know if it still fires, but it scares people." Sarah ran. Her mind moved fast, but her body felt like it already knew what to do. She moved bottles and boxes, and there it was, rusty, heavy, but with a firm barrel. She grabbed it, and as she did, she felt something new run through her body. It wasn't power. It was control. Outside, the roar ceased, and then silence, until a voice broke the calm. "Jake! Well, look what the wind blew back in." Jake walked out with firm steps, with Tony and Dave behind him. On the other side of the parking lot, a dozen men rode black bikes. They all wore vests without insignia, tattooed faces, weapons in sight. The one leading the group removed his helmet, revealing a deep scar on his neck and a crooked smile. "Luis the devil," Dave muttered. Jake didn't flinch. "Thought you were dead. And I thought you'd hung up the leather, but I see you're still playing savior. What are you doing defending this shitty little store?" Jake shrugged. "Dave's got better coffee than the hell you come from." Luis laughed, but his eyes were pure ice. "We got business to settle. One of mine says you beat him, stole his weapon. He came armed into a closed store intending to abuse a woman. I don't care if he was your cousin, your soldier, or your dog, not here." Luis dropped the smile. "Then you and yours are on my list." "Well, say it out loud," Tony said, spinning his chain like a propeller. Before Luis could respond, Blue lights began flashing in the distance. Sirens. Someone was coming. Several in Luis's group turned nervously. "You call the cops?" the devil spat. "No," Jake replied. "She activated an old alarm. I didn't even know if it still worked." Luis raised his gun. "Then we'll do this quick." And he fired. Chaos erupted like thunder. Jake rolled to the side and fired with a pistol he'd pulled from his vest. Tony and Dave threw themselves into combat with the fury of a gale. The attackers responded with handguns, bats, chains. The sirens were getting closer, but not close enough yet. From inside, Sarah watched everything through the cameras. Her breathing quickened. She saw Jake cover Dave from a shot, Tony take down two with his chain, and then one of the men veered toward the store. With quick steps, he tried to enter through the back. Sarah saw him through the convex mirror above the door. She didn't hesitate. She loaded the shotgun, aimed, and when the man crossed the door, she fired. The blast shook the walls. The impact wasn't lethal, but enough to knock down the intruder. He fell on his back, screaming and bleeding from the shoulder. Sarah was shaking, but she didn't fall. She stayed standing. Outside, patrol cars finally arrived. 3 cars, lights on. Luis's bikers began to disperse. One after another, they started their bikes and fled. The devil was the last to back away, aiming at Jake from a distance. "This isn't over." "It never is," Jake replied. And with that, Luis disappeared into the noise of the engine. The police officers got out armed, but seeing Jake slowly lowering his weapon and Sarah coming out of the store with a shotgun in her hands, they stopped. One of the officers, a man about 50 with dark glasses, lowered his radio and looked at Jake with recognition. "You again, you bastard." Jake nodded with a tired smile. "We on time?" the officer asked. "A little after the show, but yeah." Sarah walked up to Jake, the shotgun hanging from her arm. She had the torn shirt, dust stains on her face, and her soul burning. "You okay?" he asked her. She took a deep breath, then smiled. "I think so." Jake approached, looked down at her, and adjusted the jacket over her shoulders. "Your dad would be proud. Very proud." She didn't know what to say. Jake took a step back, and before getting on his bike, he turned one last time. "Leave the lights on a little longer. You're never as alone as you think." And with that, he mounted his Harley. Tony and Dave did the same. The 3 started up, and their bikes disappeared among the empty streets of Phoenix, leaving behind only smoke and a memory. Sarah stayed at the store entrance, watching as the sky cleared. The first ray of sun broke through the clouds as the sirens went silent, and the police interrogated the captured attackers. She went back inside, looked at the mess, fallen shelves, broken glass, blood on the floor. But something inside her was cleaner than ever. She approached the switch and turned on the lights. A slight, honest smile appeared on her face for the first time in years. She was alive. She was standing. And she was no longer afraid.